I want to begin today with an image I haven't been able to shake since I returned from Molokai, Hawaii, an island that sits between Maui and Oahu, two of the most aggressively developed places in the United States. On Molokai, there is no tourism industry. Billionaires have bought the land and found they cannot do anything with it because the local people won't allow it. Not because of zoning, but because of a kind of stubbornness, and I mean that with the deepest respect. Who gets to decide the value of a place? And who gets to decide the metric? I brought that question to Krista Braum Amoy, a Danish practitioner I think of as a social architect, someone who reads a place the way a building architect reads a site, and to John Diamond, who has spent decades watching these same tensions play out in the UK. Together we talk about the value that top-down economic models miss, about what it takes for a public manager to move from solving to noticing, and about what Krista believes may be a new kind of university, one that has been growing quietly in local communities all along. So let's go. Let's get started. It is lovely to be with you both here today. And we're going to open up with just some conversation around who it is that decides what creates the value in the community. And I think this is a very engaging question because a lot of people don't stop and think about where that value comes from. And I want to just let Krista respond to this, and then John, if you will too, because we have three perspectives here, Krista from Denmark and John and UK, but also anywhere else that you would like, that you've experienced this kind of unsettling question of exactly who is going to create value in our communities. So if you could just say a few words, Krista, because we're going to dive deeper into your approach, but give us a sense of how you would respond to that question.
Yeah, well, I think I see the same thing in Denmark, where there's a lot of struggles and fights, power struggles about what is value creation at local places. And I'm not that much into tourism. I don't know much about that, but I can see the same kind of discussions about what is value, what is public value. I think many Danish municipalities has been very concerned about how to involve the market public organization in the value creation at local places. And sometimes it's also a dominating way of thinking about value creation, and you kind of overlook all the local stories and relations and communities and meeting places because you think about value creations in the term of creating profit. So I think these two different kind of paradigms are fighting. But I also see a new kind of movement, actually. And I think it's because we're facing a lot of what we call wicked problems. And that is kind of pushing our thinking in new directions. I don't know if you want an example on that now, or we can wait with that later.
Yes, no, go ahead. Give us an example.
Yeah, for instance, what we're talking about a lot, also political, is that we are going to have a lot of elderly people in Denmark in the future. And we don't have the warm hands to take care of our elderly as we did before in our welfare society. And a lot of municipal CEOs are talking about we might have the money resources, but what we are lacking in the future is professionals able to take care of our elderly people. And that is also influencing our way of thinking about local places. One municipality in the south of Denmark is wanting to create a whole new kind of a place for elderly. So instead of just creating affordable housing for seniors and having some caretakers there, they want to create a whole new kind of ecosystem where young people and experienced people and various group of people and nature and culture can create new kind of ecosystems where everybody is taking care of each other. So that's another way of addressing the question of how to create public value now and in the future. And
Yes.
that's, challenging pop managers and professionals and citizens, because we need to rethink um, what is public value? Is it a
Yeah.
service? No, it might not be. It might be some kind of creating process together with the place.
Yes. And the metric may not be profits. It may be the actual energy that comes from the community that shows up and says, this is what we want, which is a different metric, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, so the value creation will be the community and the community process, because the co-creation is actually creating new kind of infrastructures, social structures, local infrastructures, new meeting places, relations between various people that we in our industrial society have isolated, and that we need to bring them together to create value together, to create new kind of infrastructures. So that
Yeah.
is the value creation in this
That's
case.
right. I'd like John to share his experience. And I have to imagine, too, from what Krista and I just presented, that you must see in the UK challenges to this. It's one thing to say, that sounds really great, Nancy, but the challenges that come with it for the local governments is really immense. Where do you see this in the UK?
So um, I think there are kind of three parts to maybe thinking about the opening question and response to what Krista was saying. One is just to pick up, Nancy, on your example of your visit to Hawaii. So if you take tourism as an exemplar of, I think, a growing, certainly here in the UK, and I think globally too, a growing awareness that sites of really important historic and cultural interest are at risk of being over-visited and damaged in some way. And that seems to me to combine both examples of resistance to that kind of profit dimension, but it also talks about, or maybe illustrates, the emergence of new ways of in which people identify with their historic and cultural settings. So my brother lives in the Orkney Island, just off the north east coast of Scotland, and they have had, over the last few years, a real problem with large ships bringing tourists to the islands in order to visit historic sites. And yes, the historic sites are fascinating and really interesting, and they tell us something about our history and so on. But there's a growing movement there to resist that. And that has an economic impact that they are resisting against. And I think that's an interesting dilemma or tension, where the act of resistance might be seen to be not in your interests. So people are resisting the possibility of jobs and an economic development, whereas both the tourist providers and those who manage the kind of the resources of the local authority that manages the islands are also caught in a dilemma about, this is going to generate income. So there's that. I think if we go back long enough, and we don't have to go back that far, but we can go back into the 1960s here in the UK, where attempts to plan and redevelop towns and cities did result in legislation around the need for consultation. So the ways in which people were then asked about, what do you think about housing development or a road development? I'm not saying that was perfect. And as someone who has protested about some of those things in the past and then watched them build, I know that the outcomes are mixed. But there is something there about people saying, this is our place, this is our community, and we want to keep it in the way that it is. But I think there's something, the third bit, I think, is something which you were talking about, Krista, which is, I was thinking that there are some visible and invisible examples of value creation. And often the invisible ones are invisible to those kind of policymakers and decision makers who think they have the solution to a particular locality or a particular community, and they identify what that solution is. And what they don't see, because they're not counting it or they're not framing it in a particular way, is, and you talked about this, Krista, the kind of breadth of health and vitality that exists. Now, that's not true in all cases, but oftentimes I think it is. And there are examples, I think, here in the UK and I think elsewhere of where, picking up on something else you were saying, Krista, this idea of ecosystems, the idea of kind of networks that work well together, if we can facilitate their coming together, that those situations, those places where those systems are not identified or certainly not valued, are likely, to suffer as a result of that. But perhaps, and this is one of those perverse outcomes, people may group together and form resistance, which leads to something which they hadn't anticipated, because they're able to mobilize their voice and their sense of what they need in the place where they are. And so a different kind of value gets created, one that wasn't identified by the decision makers. That idea, I think, again, Krista, you talk about this, the top-down approach, and that which even within the community wasn't identified.
If I could just put a pin in that, it is that there is in that top-down approach a more likely action of activism as a result. So it is a different kind of engagement than what Krista, and I want to turn to Krista now to talk a little bit about this. The kind of engagement that you are suggesting and you're active in your work with the municipalities is something that you talk about as kind of a micro experimentation, which when we did our preliminary talk, I said, well, we kind of like to call that innovation, but it's different. It's when you talk about this. So give us a sense of, help us to understand your approach and understanding of what micro experimentation might look like in a place and why it's important to understanding the place.
Ooh, there's a lot of questions. I'll see if I can rabble them out. But I think there might be an important distinction, as you say, between innovation and micro experiments. A lot of organizations really wants to be innovative and create innovative healthcare, and they're thinking about it as programs, top-down programs that can be implemented at particular places. In the healthcare system in Denmark, you see it understood as we need robots, for instance, to take care of elderly in housing, for instance. Or in the police, you have specific ideas about what is innovation in the police academy. But micro experiments are different, I think, because they are about the everyday life. They are about the stories that are already being told. They're about relation practices. And so I often think that there is a lot of everyday innovation finding place at places, but we don't see them because we're looking for another kind of understanding about what is value. We want to see a product, or we want to see an outcome. And micro experiments are much more subtle. It can be about changing small parts of the system, creating another kind of meeting with the patients or with the young people, where roles are shifting or transforming, where the young people sitting there might get another kind of voice. So it's like subtle, small experiments with how you can participate and meet people in various situations. That could be an example.
Yes.
But of course, you can also think about it in a more mission-driven perspective, where you kind of want to create a whole field of relations that are beginning to do these kind of micro experiments. So you can do it much more strategically also.
You have to be a very good observer, I am sure, to sort of guide that process, to be able to help people notice what it is. I think that's the skill, is being able to notice. And there's a very powerful quote that I want to come to that you talk about having to do with the place as an agent. But first, I think John also has talked in the past, and I'd like him to just highlight this now, in terms of embedded practices, which again, that takes a bit of noticing to get to know a place. And you said that we should not assume that we understand the local. Going back to Molokai or Hawaii, that was the biggest objection. Why do people think they come in and understand that they know more about agriculture and that this is what we should do with our agriculture, for instance? But it shows up in so many ways. So if you could just maybe talk about your sense of how embedded practices are so important to getting to know a place, and how do you go about even recognizing what that might be?
So I think this is one of the hardest things facing public managers and activists as well, actually. And I think it also is one of the hardest things that's facing those who work with public managers and the kind of the education and training and professional learning and development. Because I think there are probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 different things going on at the same time. If you're a housing specialist or someone working with the elderly that Krista was talking about, in order to kind of appreciate this, one is just recognizing and valuing and being valued for the skill and knowledge that you have. So I think that one of the things that we have to be careful about is that a number of public managers are very skilled in certain respects. They have a kind of technical knowledge, they have a functional knowledge, they have oftentimes an understanding of the system they are working in and the structure of that. And that's really, really important. But at the same time, what we're asking them to do is to work much, much more cooperatively with people who don't have the same functional knowledge, but actually have a different knowledge and a different understanding of the place and a different awareness of that. And so you're asking someone who has been told that they are very skilled and highly valued to say, in this setting, I'm not as highly skilled and as highly valued as I think I am, or as I'm being told by my organization. And that's okay, because by working cooperatively, and that means listening, it means noticing, it means suggesting as opposed to telling, and it means allowing ideas to develop. You might well find yourself in a position where you are even more highly valued and highly regarded by your organization. So it's not a situation, I think, in which people feel they have to lose something. Although I think some people do feel that for part of the time, their sense of identity is being challenged and questioned. And yet, if we can get this right, it leads to something which is not only beneficial and positive for residents and community groups and individuals, but is also good in terms of the job that somebody's doing. Just to give a kind of, if I can, just one practical example of the ecosystem for the elderly that you were talking about before. Again, this is taking something from a long time ago here I'm sitting in Manchester in the northwest of England. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, they were developing new schools, and they experimented with a large campus school that had a school place for young children, school place for children from 11 to 16, 16 to 18, a library, a community centre, and a home for the elderly, all on the same campus, all kind of in very close proximity. And it was an experiment to see if that could work as a place where different ages were coming together. And it was in many ways very innovative and ahead of its time. And what was fascinating and sad really was that 10 years later that was scaled down and the schools became separate units and institutions. And the idea of the integration was kind of seen as not being as important as the services were being provided. Here we are, 2026, and those ideas are kind of resurfacing.
There you were talking, John, about I think from going from an idea to formalizing, and you end up moving to a different structure that then prevents the very thing, which is what it began with, which was an opening. There's a very powerful quote from Krista. I want to let her talk about this and sort of move forward wherever she would like to go with ideas. We have a specific case to talk about, the facts case, but anything, I think what John was just saying, we have to highlight another maybe abstract idea, but it's a very important one. You said, Krista, that a place has some kind of agency. A place, it's almost in Hawaiian, they call it that sovereignty of place. A place has a sense of agency. It affords us to have some kinds of relations and not others. So it's a kind of creating a field of being together, of positions, of relations, of qualities. And if that's the foundation, we are talking about a whole different process of value creation. And I'd like you to respond and talk however you'd like from your experience, Krista, what that means to you and what that looks like in your practice.
Yeah, I will try to, and maybe also respond to some of the examples from John, because that is something I work a lot with, also with try to train public managers to jump out from the town hall or the healthcare center or the military or the police academy in a specific sense, to jump out and be a part of the place. And instead of looking up and down in the formal organization, try to sense the place and sense all the embedded practices, relations and barriers and stories. And when John was talking, I just had a recently experience. I had, I think, 20 public managers out at this specific place in Copenhagen, where we are trying to train the capacity to understand a place. So one exercise is about they're going around this place and they're going to map the place. They're going to find places that they sense create life and communities, relations, and they're going to map places that are a barrier for communities, relations, and for life. And these 20 people are moving around in different groups, and they're coming back, and they are asked or invited to begin to see new kind of possibility for creating life at this specific place in Copenhagen. And I just remember one of these public managers from the defense ministry or something like that, a military dude. And he was so angry at this point when we came back, because what was this process about? Where was the problem? What kind of problem was he going to solve if there weren't any problem? And he was like totally lost in this kind of wild process, mapping the places. So I think that speaks exactly what you're talking about, John. This is, you think you have all the things you need to be a professional in our professional organizations, and all of a sudden you are asked to jump out in this more like unknown, subtle place, and you are asked to sense it. What kind of capacity or competence is that, and what should you do with it? So just to respond to that I recognize that it is challenging the professionals, and we often have these kind of talks. What are the meaning with working with places and understanding places? How can we use it, and how can we use this whole idea back in our traditional organization, where we are often very blinded by our silos and institutions, and instead jumping out in this place and begin to see how everything is interconnected, the mental, the social, the natural, the physical ecosystems that are creating a whole new potential place and a new way of understanding what is a problem. And problems might live different places in a place. So if you are in a hierarchy, you often think about problems as you need to go from A to B. You have a problem and you find a solution. But when you jump out and understand problems from the place, you can see that the problem might live different kind of places, and you need to point out those places and work with it as a kind of a system acupuncture, and work with how to create more new kind of interventions, these different kind of places. And how can you think about an intervention not as something that you implement from above, but as a process you want to activate together with the people that are there? So that is also, disturbing our thoughts about what is a good manager or a good professional, because all of a sudden you don't have any answers and you just need to facilitate the space.
Yeah. And the facilitation is actually recognizing that you're working with a system. So in a traditional sense, you might think, well, here's a problem over here, we'll solve that. And then here's a problem. Oh, it popped up over here, we'll solve that problem. Instead of having that more integrated approach to a larger conversation about what it is that's really trying to be accomplished. And I want you to tell us a story about the Faxe municipality. And it's a very concrete example that I think communities can relate to and understand. And I think it gets to, again, the heart of what we're talking about here, if you could.
Well, we're going to Faxe municipality is a medium-sized municipality in Denmark, and this place has a lot of socio-economic problems, a lot of families that are not having jobs, kids that are not thriving. So they have a lot of family issues, problems with kids that are falling down between different kind of chairs, not going to school, not going to the youth clubs or any kind of activities. And then the whole board of public managers went to Edinburgh, and they saw a culture festival there. And they thought, okay, we want a culture festival for young people and kids in our municipality as well, because we saw that that was a way to create communities. And the CEO of the culture area that I have a long history of working together with, she said to them, I would like to make this happening, but I want to do it in another kind of way. I don't just want to create a culture festival, bringing in the biggest musicians for young people. I want to understand it as a process where we are actually mobilizing the local community. So it's going to be a co-creating process. So we started that to think about it as a way, as culture and art, theater, performance as a driver for change and for creating communities. And we actually began by, I think we were 40 people. We mapped out who are relevant for young people, for kids, the school area, libraries, all the public organizations. And we also had around 25 musicians, performances, theater people living in the area and working in the area, and we brought them together. And we began by asking them, could you please take pictures of the places where you move around and take these snap logs, that we call them, and make a small logbook. Where do you see life? Where do you see not that much life, like smaller, low energy? What is happening? And we begin to map all these pictures and started new kind of conversations. So instead of having one festival in the main city in this area, we saw that there was a lot of the small villages where they needed some kind of activities, where the families and the communities were closing around themselves and were not participating. Because it's also very difficult to move around in the geographical area because the politicians have cut off public transportation. So everybody needs to drive around for themselves to get to the main city. So we reframed the idea. So the festival were going to be a caravan, moving between these three places. So 3 days, 3 festivals, and involving the local people. And now we are in year 2, and we're going to, do all this one more time, but also now trying to massage this idea into the public schools. So the Culture Festival is going to be a part of the school scheme. You can participate in creating this event when you are in public school. So it's going to be a part of the way you can work with culture, and in the music school and, all these kind of institutions. So the idea is also, the festival, that's a nice output for the politicians to show we have a festival and 1,000 people and more young people are participating. But I think the true value lies in the smaller organizations that we are creating in the process, professionals that have never met each other before across daycare and library and the music school and all these kind of public institutions. So they're beginning to understand each other and they can reach out to each other, and they can, if they have a young girl, boy that is not, joining any kind of activities, they can say, how can we help this young girl? She's playing trumpet, but she's not going to school. Can we maybe involve her in the music school and then think about it as a job? So can we actually pay her for, helping the other kids to play trumpet? So creating all new kind of of
Yeah,
ways. So it's kind of wayfinding and helping
yeah.
the kids creating new pathways.
You'd used the word too, affordances, which I hope that we can in another space talk a little bit about that term and what that means, because this is really inside a system being able to understand where the natural resources exist, which is much different, as you pointed out, but I'm not sure I think this is the main point. This isn't a little committee that comes together and says, we're going to come up with this amazing festival. This is a much different process. And I think it's important to highlight why that creates value. And John, you can jump in here that we know good festivals and we've all been to them, but there's something different about a festival that comes sort of from the roots, that's organic in its development. And there was something that you said in our earlier meeting that, kids were not as responsive to those type of activities that were created by the municipality. Like, they had wanted to be at the point of creation. They wanted to be part of the process. And so if just that understanding of, to make it clear that that's a different kind of value, like what is that creating for the municipality, helps us really land this idea of how to develop a sense of place.
Can I just give one small example? Because when you talk about this, what came to mind was a picture that one of the participants took from some of these places, and that was a group of young teenagers standing out in the cold one night at a school corner in a very empty parking lot. And they were giggling and, but standing there freezing. And when the girl from all the churches in the area saw that picture, she said, is that the school place there and there? Why don't you offer them to go over to the church area? Maybe we can make a space for them there so they can stay inside because the public school is closed, but we can actually have an open space there, meeting place there. So these pictures of empty places and, young girls hanging out, began to inspire the people there to think about how can we help each other, creating new kinds of ideas. So, yeah. So actually the church and some of the what do you call it? What do you call it in English? The clubs for the youth clubs began to create a whole new kind of idea about from earth to spirit. So they wanted to work in that field with activities. How can you be sustainable, and how can you talk about some spiritual things while you're working with the gardens? So this is an example, I think, about the of the place and how it can inspire to new kinds of activities.
That's beautiful. Any thoughts?
There are a few. I mean, one immediate one. When you're telling the story, Krista, it reminds me, I think, of the conversation we were having earlier, which is the importance of understanding how the process works. So a festival in and of itself is not necessarily, or wasn't necessarily, the primary success feature of the project you were describing. You were describing it in terms of people coming together, people who didn't know each other. And the example you gave just then of the local church goer who was saying, actually, we could open our building because the school is closed. But if I'm a funder or I'm a politician, the festival is really good. It's a really good outcome. And I can celebrate that and talk about the vitality of the community. And so I think it's an example, I think, about a visible, invisible public value that gets created. So for the politician, the visible outcome is the festival. For those engaged in the process, and they might not describe it like this, it's those what started off as invisible relationships that over time then become highly visible and then become ways in which festivals might carry on. But actually what's being created, to go back to our earlier conversation, are practices which are rooted in an understanding of place. And it isn't just a kind of abstract understanding of place. It's an understanding of the individuals. And it's also an understanding of where people meet and how they come together and the things that mitigate against that and stop that from happening. So just very specific example. You talked about transport and you talked about public transport. So I think transport is a really good kind of example of when you understand or don't understand a place. So I think if you have a private car and you're used to traveling around in the car, if you're a professional, you can get to meetings on time, that's fine. If you're reliant on public transport or reliant on friends and family, you have to think about planning your time quite differently. And I thought it was really interesting what you were saying about public transport at night. It means that those young people in that place cannot travel around easily without involving other people, maybe their extended family, maybe their immediate family. It means that their ability to engage is not the same if the activity is taking place in some large community centre that has been designated as the place where these things happen, because they can't get there, they can't engage. And so there are things which I think many of us take for granted that actually we don't recognize, we don't see. And once it's shown to us, sometimes our reaction might be, there's nothing we can do about that. But the other reaction, which is what you were describing with the person from the church, might be to look at other places in the same locality that those children, young people could have access to. In order to do that, you have to know the place, and you have to be constantly recognizing that that's an evolving and developing process. It's not fixed.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's these ideas again can easily slip by as, oh, these are just, little things to solve, but they don't happen unless you first notice and then you first observe and take the time to really get to understand a place. And I want to sort of move to the role that Krista plays when she works with these organizations. I think that the term social architect came up, and I don't know if you've ever used that to describe yourself. I think of that, the differentiation between a physical architecture of a place and the social architecture of a place. And if you're building architecture, you need an architect. You need somebody who is a practitioner who can come into a place and work with you. And I'd like to, I was originally thinking about talking more about your journey and how you got here. I think that's very interesting. Both you and John come from academia, but you've moved into other roles that are outside of academia that have a much broader application to helping people, leaders, places
Mm.
become shifting the way they feel, the way they are understood. So I know you have a model, and that's where I'd really like to go now, Krista. And whether you have the model with you to put up or whether it's something we can put in the notes so people can look at it. If you could talk about that, this is something I presume maybe you can share how you use it. If it's something, you use in an introductory way to a place in a presentation, or whether it's something that you're putting inside maybe a book you're writing. I don't know if you are. So tell us a little bit about that model, and that will give us sort of a guide to the way you work.
Yeah. Well, as you said, my journey in this area has not been linear, in any terms. And I think I started maybe 15 years ago helping WHO's Danish network building communities in different places in Denmark. And we were kind of new in this field, experimenting a lot and beginning to have more examples and practices, and we developed methods. And I was trying to write about this in academia, but I think it was maybe still like too strange for understanding it as a way of thinking about innovation in the term we just started this podcast with, because it was much more relational and with places. But I think from maybe 7 years ago, we had this, we had the UN goals. You all probably know them from the UN, and the network that I was working with were translating them into peace, and were saying what is essential with all these UN goals is that we are going to create well-being for all humans and for life. So we need to work with the goals from UN, but work with them all together in one model instead of separating them. So to work with them in a much more regenerative way. And that kind of helped us to see that the work we've been doing for the last couple of years could actually be understood in this kind of frame or model that came from a WHO, but also that we were working with it in a much more participatory way than a program for these UN goals. So just to give you some context about how this model or these kind of methods or idea was developed. So it is based on people, participation, place, peace, prosperity, and sometimes I add passion, planet, or play. So you can, add new piece to this idea. But the approach is to try to understand organizing as much more organic. So thinking about if we want to design, create, nurture life, we need to work with these different kind of piece to ask ourselves questions. If I want to nurture life, what do I need? What about people? Have we set some kind of practice mission? What are we together about? Have we talked about that? So that could be like one way to begin the conversation between municipality and civic society, for instance. Or you can ask, what about the participation? Do we actually work with processes where you don't just hide in your formal role, but where you can actually kind of feel each other and the place? You put yourself into movement rather to have like a specific position in the system. So think about, could you experiment with how to participate in real felt ways? So that could be another question to work with this more organic way of organizing. But it could also be, and that is where I often start, to begin with the place and say, let's meet out at this specific place and begin to map what do we see of resources, institutions, but also qualities of life that are real felt, of feelings like atmospheres, energy, all these kind of subtle things. Where did you have your first ice cream with your granddad? Or, what are the stories of the place? What are the stories of the deep time here? For instance, in Faxe municipality, we begin to talk about Rollo. That was a Viking from way back. And this Rollo figure became a theater play. It became a card play for having conversations. So all of a sudden, the past were connected with the future or with the present time. So so just to understand that working with these different kind of pieces is trying to nurture life, ask different kind of questions, and also thinking that if you begin with the place and people and say, let place and the task or the mission define who are relevant, then you begin to work cross-disciplinary, and that can also create a lot of paradoxes, tensions, conflicts. So you also need to think about how to handle that in the process. So peace could also be a place where you begin to ask new kind of questions to address this new world of problems that you are creating. And for instance, in Faxe municipality, we had one opera singer actually who was very, against this whole process because it was disturbing, her conversations with the municipality. She was already inside the public school, creating a lot of activities, and this made her position much more insecure. Did she have that job? Should she co-create something totally new? So addressing all these kind of conflicts also along the way. And what we are often not trying to do is that instead of just talking, reflecting all the time, maybe try to think about what are the smallest of the smallest step that we can take. Can we try to experiment with a small new action? Could she invite us to her place, her community? And could that maybe create another kind of conversation and make her more safe? So try to do something together instead of just talking about conflicts. And then you have prosperity as one of the last piece if you're following the whole compass around. And that's addressing exactly what John was talking about just before. You can understand this process is creating value on different bottom lines. Do you call it that in English? So
Yes.
it's creating mental health. I would say when we ask these people that are participating in this process, they're like, "It was so fun, we were going out and exploring, and we were trying to create new kind of things. They were playing." So the people that are doing this is actually feeling they're thriving, and they saying it's much better than having a better, more money for the work that you do. It's actually a fun process, and it's also creating communities, but communities across silos and roles and organizations. So it's new forms of communities also. It's not only young people or elderly people. It's like, making people create a new kind of working community. And then it's also creating place, of course, creating value for the place, because we're creating a festival, we're creating activities, and not only in the summer period, but also along the way, experimenting with where can we practice music, where can we paint, where can we have a theater play, So there's also different kind of values along the way, activities, communities. But I think the hardest part is actually to create value for the people, for the young people that are experience this peripheral participation, that are all the time like in the peripheral of
Yes,
yeah
on the periphery.
yeah, because it takes, efforts to just not having a
Yeah.
party for the people that wants to be a part of it, but all the time thinking about who are more vulnerable, how can we create a place for them, activities that are relevant for them as well.
Well, I think, Krista, I want to ask you how you describe your role, because there's a lot there. And we talked about this in the earlier, the prep conversation. If somebody wanted to either be a Krista or find a Krista, what are they looking for? And how do you see yourself, your role? Because you've really identified a lot of competencies in that last conversation of what really is important for that compass to be energized, to be enacted. How do you describe your role?
Well, I think I'm kind of a facilitator, facilitating communities, but also I think it's kind of communities for learning, because there aren't, any right or wrong answers. It's about finding new pathways. So it's
Mhm.
also emerging futures, emergent communities. All of us are pathfinding scholars somehow. So in my terms, I also think this is a new kind of becoming a researcher, because this is
Mm.
about making knowledge about communities, translating it into a practice almost. So thinking about local communities are not just local communities eating together, having dinner together, or doing kind of different kind of things. It's a learning community. You learn about resilience, about health, about the place, and so I think it's a new kind of thinking about a university.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. John, I'm going to let you respond to that. What kind of seeds are planted by this conversation today and Krista's approach? What potential do you see in the field of public management?
I think the couple of things you said earlier, Krista, you were talking about working in a relational way, and you were working in an organic way, and the process was organic. But you were also describing the compass. So you were describing I don't want to use the word framework, but you were describing a way of thinking and a way in which people can recognize the different dimensions of where they're situated. And they can come into that conversation, I guess, through any one of the P's, because that might be their starting point. But actually, because you stress the relational, and because you stress the sense in which this will take place over time, and there isn't a kind of fixed way of doing this, because we haven't yet agreed how we want to describe the success of our work, because that's dialogic and so on. I think that's an incredibly significant and important role to play. And I think the kind of immediate learning that might happen for those people engaged in that process will be profound. I think the other thing that we haven't talked about is that, and I think it's both a strength and a challenge for the process you're describing. I think is that you have to have credibility with very different audiences. So you have to have credibility with the practitioners and the professionals you're working with. And then you have to have credibility with those grant funders or with the academic community, because there are times when you will want to use that community to write about and describe what's happening and to kind of promote the learning that comes from that. And I think most of us, I think, don't operate in that space where there are almost different languages that we have to speak and different time frames that we have to address. And I think you and people like you who work in that space have to kind of navigate quite a lot. The thing I would say, which I think is just coming back exactly to the example you've been giving, and there might be time in another podcast to come back to this actually as a kind of follow-up, is that and this is true, I think, for anybody working with children and young people, particularly young people, is that you kind of only working with them perhaps for a relatively short period of time because they're changing and developing and growing. And I can think of people that I work with who have maintained contact with some of the young people they've worked with and can talk about what's happened to them in terms of their development, both as people as well as activists or parents even. And I think that particular group of people is hard, I think, for professionals who don't come from that background. So for housing, for planners, for some of the other agencies, then that group of young people can represent a bit of a difficult group to work with because their needs change. And also they move on. They literally move on, or they move into a different role in the place where they live. And so you're asking people to engage in a process which might have a kind of short lifespan for very particular young people, but can have a long lifespan in terms of the process as a whole. So I think this is where schools are really important, both as places, to engage with, but they can also be difficult places,
Mm.
But I think thinking about ways in which, if I was a public servant, ways in which I'm going to gain from this, it isn't just about my professional career. It's also about having positive experiences of working in a particular place and seeing the value. So another use of the term value, the value that comes from working in that way.
Mm.
Yeah. I think about just the ability to uncover or discover the stories, that the stories hold the potential of the place, and that the gift of the process that you described, Krista, is all the ways that you can approach those stories. Because every time you touch one of those places in your compass, you're touching a different, a different vibe, a different heartstring, a different experience, whether it's negative or positive. You also just in your story hit on some of the tensions that can arise. And
Mm.
so another skill you have to have, which I think have to be able to build that trust that your opera singer, people who have some already established way of doing things, and you're suggesting that we're open to doing things a new way, that can feel very threatening. So I really take away from this process a couple things. One being just the importance of that process. I have experienced this in my own work. When I come in, it's my relationship that allows me to get away with asking them to tell stories. And it's like, what is she doing asking us
Mm.
to tell stories? And then at the end, they're like, that was great. And there's some new idea that can come out of that process. It's just, to me, there's just such a stark contrast in how we might do public management. And it's just a matter, I think, of engaging. It's not that there's a right way or wrong way. It's this engagement piece and where it comes from. And the co-creation. You use that term. I think most people know what that means. But maybe in closing, Krista, just any final words on your philosophy?
Yeah, I think that's what we're trying to work with, right? And I'm using this compass as a way to engage, as John said, many different kind of partners in this development, exploring the place in different kind of ways, and it has its potential, and of course sometimes you meet some kind of resistance also because you need to rethink your role in it. Maybe the potential is also show it, don't tell it sometimes, let's just meet out there and begin the job instead of saying that too much. I think maybe that could be a part of it also. Do more than talking about on a distance what you're doing, because that will invite more people into the process. Yeah, you need to experiment all the time. And I think what we succeeded with in Faxe municipality was to create a shared mission. It was to begin to create new kind of lines of life between library, daycare, clubs and schools and etc. And I also think that we in some ways succeeded, that we have been part of big conferences now, and conversations about some of the new reforms that we are working with in Denmark, the healthcare reform, the elderly care reform, because these reforms actually want to involve places and the civic society much more in the value creations of public welfare. So in Denmark, I think there is a really a good timing for working with these kind of areas. The politicians, the system begins to see and acknowledge the value you can create locally. But still, I think they're thinking about it in a little bit linear way also, because they want to have a hospital that can create an activity with a partner in the civic society, and then you kind of build a bridge there, instead of beginning to work with how can we connect the dots in the local place and begin to create a new value together. So jump out in this unknown and begin to create new pathways and new forms of value. I think that's still a journey we're on in here in Denmark.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to close it up here, and it has been just a wonderful conversation. I would like this to be the seed of further conversations. I think we have so much more that we can dive into. So let's let this conversation settle a little bit and maybe get some reactions from others and see where we might go with it. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Krista.
Thank you both.